There's a PR problem for GoFundMe that they're constantly running up against, which is like, be depressing enough to like get people to donate to you, but don't be so depressing that you ruin our brand, right?
Where do I go from here?
A ray of sunshine. Just keep going.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to In the Meanwhile. I'm Nora Kenworthy.
And I'm Marcus Harrison Green. Nora, as usual, it has been a week. We've got a whistleblower at the Social Security Administration confirming what we all suspected, which is that Doge has been handling our private information about as well as Pete Hegseth handles signal chats, i.e. not well.
True.
We've got Trump taking aim at Fed Governor Lisa Cook for the alleged reason of false statements on her mortgage applications. This from the guy whose idea of financial transparency is trust me, bro, and whose tax returns are more classified than nuclear codes. Also, it should be noted that Lisa Cook is, of course, black and a woman. So,
yes.
Yeah, say no more. And we've got something called a habab attacking Arizona right now. Like, even our natural disasters have jumped the shark. My God.
I know. Is it a habab or a haboob? Like, either one is kind of terrible, but...
You know, I didn't want to get canceled by saying haboob, so I just went with habab. Like that's the reason.
I know we have to. I think it's my new favorite kind of natural disaster. Like we all need one, right? A giant wall of dust and debris that destroys everything in its path should be familiar to all of us at this point. So haboob governing is basically the official policy of the Trump administration.
My God, yes. Well, in these end times when tyranny ticks like a time bomb and your landlord just turns your laundry room into a luxury Airbnb suite. That really happened to a friend of mine. The news I didn't know I needed dropped, Nora. You know what? Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce are engaged. Civilization may collapse, but at least the one-woman pop industrial complex known as Taylor found herself an athlete with a good bone structure. And so perhaps there is hope for some, if not all of us. Anyway, this podcast is here to offer clarity and calm, at least relative to whatever is on your Instagram feed at this moment.
Props to Taylor. We'll take the wins where we can get them.
Yes, we will.
And I love you actually broke this news to me earlier this week, Marcus, because I was so offline that I did not even get the notifications.
Yes, it counts as breaking news for the New York Times now. Like that is I saw it 10 minutes before I sent it to you. So you were only slightly behind. It wasn't egregious.
I was behind like at least several million Taylor Swifties.
My God, yes. Yes. The news has been it's been I guess met with jubilation. It seemingly so. So anyhow.
Well, we'll take what we can get.
Yes, we will. Yes, we will.
But clarity and calm is a generous description of what we provide listeners each week. But speaking of clarity, we thought it might be a good time to take listeners back to the beginning of this podcast, or origin story, if you will. It's less Marvel blockbuster and more like a scrappy DIY zine that you pick up at a Capitol Hill dive bar. Except instead of poetry about your ex, it's us screaming into the mic about democracy collapsing. I
gotta say, Nora, it's like you were accessing a specific memory with that whole poetry about your ex thing. Is that I just put it out there. I'm not. If you don't want to comment on it, I'm fine. Anyway,
someday I will tell you the story about having to take an actual poetry writing class with an ex who shared poetry about me. So,
oh my God, like it
was like peak awkwardness
to your face. Like you were there in the classroom as he was doing this.
Oh yes, it was a small seminar. It was like 10 of us, and we were workshopping.
Oh my God,
a poem.
I admire you for so much.
Pandora's box of awkward encounters.
Oh my God, there is no way I would have made it through like any of that class. So kudos to you, my friend. This is the courage that we need to fight, tyranny right now. You always demonstrate it. So there you go. But yes, dear listener, like every podcast bro and Silicon Valley con artist, we have got an origin story.
Except ours doesn't involve faking admission into Stanford or bilking investors or slapping an app logo on something that humanity's been doing since fire was discovered.
Oh, God. Thank Lordy. Yes, the only thing we're guilty of inventing is yet another distraction to keep you pacified while this empire burns.
But seriously, should we tell people like what we're actually doing?
You know what? Yeah, I guess so. I'm not gonna lie. I'm a bit hooked on the whole poetry class with an X, like
That is
delivering
going to
it
have to be a different episode when I am fully prepared to divulge that information.
Okay, well, the Patreon, well, we might have to start a Patreon listen, just for that whole thing. That being said, in all seriousness, there have been so many people who have, since we started this podcast, we're 14 episodes in, over 2 months now. There have been some people who have been like, how in the world did you all actually meet? Like, what was the connection? And, okay, like,
or they're like, who are you? Why are you doing this with this random lady?
Yeah, that is that has actually been asked. Yes, I'm not gonna lie. That being said, the thing is, it's there's sometimes you just have, I don't believe in fate. People know that. I don't believe in some, things happen for a reason. I do believe in serendipity though, and so back in 2020, there was this thing called the COVID. That I guess it's completely over, and folks don't mask. Maybe it was a hoax that some people say. I don't know. It seems very real to me, and ever clear and present danger. But that is another episode for another day. Anyhow, though, during that time period, I was doing a piece about crowdfunding, particularly at a time period where so many people, didn't have access to resources and didn't have, access to medical care. This was a time before the government did the sort of the bare minimum in terms of, in my opinion, the bare minimum in terms of making sure that everybody was whole and solid, if you will, during the height of the pandemic. And so I reached out to Nora to ask her about, you don't know this, Nora, but I did a one of those like Google Scholar things, and I typed in, find me somebody on. I don't know why all of a sudden I'm
back in the time when like women were still in the search results.
Yes, and before everybody of like worth like went up to Canada to like have an actual job at the University of Toronto, where they didn't have to think about fascism, I guess. But anyway, and you popped up, and I remember emailing you. You're like, yeah, let's talk. And we had this great conversation about, the true cost of crowdfunding, if you will, the fact that it was disproportionately, quite frankly, white folks who were, getting the help, even though it was folks who are from historically marginalized communities that needed more of the help, right? I mean, as it sort of relates to society at large. And I thought it was a great conversation that we had. We'll try to link to that original piece in the show notes. And then from there, I want to say, what is it, maybe 3 years later or so, that you ended up contacting
me. Long pandemic years.
Yeah, it just seemed like 30 at the time. And anyway, you reached back out and you're like, hey, would you be, your wonderful book came out, and you said, you were going to be featured doing a talk at Town Hall Seattle, and you were like, hey, you'd be a great interlocutor. I think that's what they call them there at Town Hall Seattle, which is basically just a fancy word for an interviewer. And
unpaid interviewer.
You did give me free food. I got some wonderful cheese and crackers there, and a soda. It was well worth it, Nora. And we had a great conversation, about your book and about, crowdfunding and the true cost of crowdfunding, obviously, and the terrible structure that is our current healthcare system in the United States. And there are so many people afterwards who just came up and said, hey, you guys had a lot of, great conversational chemistry, and is that the first time y'all were actually on stage together? Have you, how long have you known each other, and yada, yada.
You're like, yeah, actually, we've never been in person.
Yeah, not at all, other than just that day. And it was automatically, it was evident to a lot of people there. It was evident to me, like, this is a person who's like kind of awesome, and like I want to like do something in life with them that's a great thing that could help benefit people. And instead of that, we ended up doing this podcast. Exactly. So here we are.
No, but like one of the reasons that I reached out to you to do the town hall event was, with that project and with that research, I was lucky enough to talk to a lot of journalists, and I felt like the questions that you asked me were fundamentally different than what any other journalist was asking me over a very long period of time, because your questions centered community and they centered the experience of everyday people. And in particular, they were really focused on these questions of equity. You know, I felt like with every other reporter, they were like following the trend, and I had to like sort of preach to them about like, no, the real story here is a story about racial justice and social inequities. And that was like front and center for you. And it was just so refreshing to talk to someone who really got it from the outset. And so I think I feel very lucky to have had that call from you, because it really shaped the trajectory of where I took that work, the kinds of questions that I took up in the book. And I feel doubly lucky that you invited me to do this podcast with you.
Yeah, I mean, if, you know, to go back to Taylor Swift, if we were going to a concert, Nora, I would give you a friendship bracelet. We have that connection. And so, you know,
like a apocalypse buddy.
Yeah, we're getting all types of merch ideas, by the way. I mean, between this and like last week's, you know, indoctrinate these nuts, you know, potential t-shirt.
My daughter's going to have some really great craft projects in the next couple of weeks.
It might be late stage capitalism, folks, but hey, we can still engage in some commerce here and there. Anyway, that being said, Nora, this is, you know, I do a lot of these, you know, town hall talks. I've interviewed folks like Heather Cox Richardson at Town Hall Seattle. I've interviewed.
You're saying like way more famous people.
I wasn't going to say that. It's, you know, they have a couple more followers on Instagram. I mean, I don't know, way more famous, but I will say that, and I'm not just saying this because you're my podcast partner, and I hope that you continue to pay our, you know, half of our producer's salary, but yes, this is seriously like you know, my favorite conversation that I've ever had. And, you know, it's, to be honest with you, this was what launched our podcast in terms of like, this is the person who I'd want to do a weekly podcast with. And so here we are.
Aw, yeah. Marcus, thank you. I'm actually like, I usually find it extremely painful to go back to things that I've said in the past. So this whole podcasting thing is like prolonged public embarrassment for me. But you know, actually going back and listening to our conversation made me realize just how much of what we were chatting about then has just become so much more, unfortunately, relevant now.
Yes.
Just the extent to which all of us are basically trying to like crowdfund and scrappily build community our way through disaster, and it's not working and it's not enough. And you know, never has a community organizing adage of like we're all we have felt more true than in this moment.
Yeah, Nora, like, I mean, now, right, you had an estimate by the Congressional Budget Office, you know, I mean, they who knows if they'll be able to give accurate data in the future with this current president. But as of now, they did a conservative estimate that 11.8 million people could be uninsured by 2036. We continue to have growing income inequality. So to your point, right? I mean, there are going to be a lot of people in more precarious situations, and it doesn't seem that there's anybody, at least at this potential point, it's hard to forecast that there's any, you know, help that's going to, you know, come from our federal government. And so I think you're going to see more and more communities have to be more reliant upon each other. And, you know, as somebody told me recently, you know, we're all we got and all we need isn't a slogan anymore. It's just the fact of reality at this moment.
Yep. Yeah. It's a reality that we're rapidly having to learn how to tread water in, right?
Quickly though, Nora, before we get into the talk here, or I should say before we let listeners listen to our first fully recorded conversation that happened at Town Hall Seattle a couple years ago, I know you said it is very awkward to listen, you know, back to yourself. I gotta say, it is not as awkward as, again, being in a classroom with an ex in front of you reciting terrible poetry about your relationship. So Here we are, folks. It's I guarantee you this is a great conversation. And though Nora and I might feel awkward, we don't feel that awkward when it comes to, replaying this conversation. So you are in for a treat, I must say. So Nora, again, thank you for having me today to be in conversation with you. Just reading through this book, on the surface, it's about the rise in crowdfunding and what that has meant. But I mean, it's about so much more, as you point out. There are multiple collisions of everything from racism to neoliberalism to the failure of late-stage capitalism. And so I want to actually read a portion from the book that I think, is a great summation of, what you were trying to tackle in this book. And it's actually, I guess you could say, a poem or flash nonfiction portion that you open up the meat of the book with, and it's called Shame, or The Sham, excuse me. Extra, extra, read all about it. I need a bunch and wish it wasn't that much. Obamacare, Trumpcare, Medicare, everybody tells us we need it, but I can't afford health insurance, let alone COBRA. It's a no for Obamacare because I earn too little. I applied for care credit cards, but even they denied me. When the cancer got to stage 4 and she lost her job, we paid for COBRA until it ran out. If we can just raise $60,000, maybe $80,000, we can keep her alive long enough to get a transplant and Obamacare. The basis of the American economy is a sham. And what I mean by this is, unless you make $50,000 to $60,000 a year, you can't afford health insurance, even with Obamacare. What's unaffordable about the Affordable Care Act are the deductibles, the out-of-pockets, the premiums. We pay $500 a month for her insurance. But the doctors in the ER just laughed and said, nobody takes your insurance. I wish my battle had only been with cancer, but it's mostly been with bureaucracies, insurance companies, Obamacare loopholes. With each battle, the cancer keeps spreading. I opened with that, not only because you opened the book with that, but I mean, that is why so many people, feel that they have to essentially objectify themselves on a crowdfunding platform in order to get care. And when I talked to you prior to today, about what we would talk about tonight, you said you wanted to make sure that folks knew that you weren't trying to shame people for their decisions and so forth. It isn't that somebody has to go on GoFundMe and ask for, $20 donations for insulin. It's just the fact that, that circumstance exists at all. Mm-hmm. And so I want to start by asking you, what stops us as, collectively as a nation from asking, why people have to do this in the first place?
Thank you, first of all, for reading that poem. So the book does have some poems throughout it, and I've created them out of snippets of text from actual GoFundMe campaigns. And so what I'm trying to do there is sort of cultivate this kind of chorus of voices that I often encountered while doing the research, and that kind of haunted my head for 10 years. And I've often told people that it's very common to encounter the phrase, "we have nowhere else to turn." Or "this is our last option." It's probably the most common phrase that I see in crowdfunding campaigns. And it really speaks to me about the place that a lot of people are at when they turn to crowdfunding. It's often not just about letting family know that you're sick or getting some neighbors to start pulling for you, but it's really an act of very severe desperation, because our healthcare system is so expensive, particularly in moments of catastrophe, and because so many Americans cannot afford even the small catastrophes of our healthcare system. So oftentimes people are coming to these platforms with very large needs and finding some help sometimes, but often very little help. And so one of the things that I think we need to recognize is that crowdfunding thrives in places where healthcare is highly marketized and where patients and their families and their communities are carrying the bulk majority of the healthcare costs of that system. You know, we have a lot of conditions in the US that drive people to become even more economically fragile as they get sick. So it's very common to see crowdfunding campaigns for someone who's gotten cancer and then is no longer able to work because of the cancer treatments, and then they're on COBRA, and then they lose their insurance, and then they're waiting to get on public insurance. And meanwhile, they just truly can't actually pay for the cost of their care. And so for me, I think GoFundMe provides this bizarre, deeply intimate window into people's lives at these crucial moments, and how they're trying to navigate a system that is really stacked against them.
Yeah, so you brought up earlier about what you call the financial and moral toxicities, right? That sort of, keep us from potentially having a more collectivized, vision of our healthcare system. And one of the themes, though, that emerges through your book and when you're talking to various people is what I would call sort of a narrative toxicity, in the sense of, so many people, even who are in dire need, believe in this bootstraps nature, or this, rugged individualism that keeps them sometimes from, even when they're on GoFundMe, keeps them from asking for what they actually need. And then you write that's also the same thing that stops us from like actually having more collectivized, right, versions of medical care, such as potentially universal health care. Can you talk a little bit more about how, I'll just say, like the American dream is kind of killing us?
The American dream is definitely killing us. We have a really long and dirty history in the United States, as I'm sure many of you are aware, of blaming people who are most in need of care, and most in need of charity. And the ways that we do that are through racism, first of all, and also racial capitalism. And in particular, we come up with these narratives, these stories, like these moral stories, the deserving poor, right? Or pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, or trickle down economics. And these become narratives that justify our exclusion and exploitation of marginalized communities from systems of care that they deserve and that they're entitled to. And what I became interested in this book was the way that crowdfunding marketplaces were reifying and amplifying those same moral values and drilling them down into our social media feeds and into our very individual decisions of who we were going to support. So you see a lot of the same patterns playing out in crowdfunding campaigns. So-and-so is a hardworking father. He's the sole breadwinner of the family. We hate that we're here. We feel so much shame about asking for help. We'd never be those people, but we have nowhere else to turn. I mean, that's the classic GoFundMe narrative. And what that to me amplifies is a set of moral norms that are the polar opposite of what we would want if we were actually fighting for a more just healthcare system, a healthcare system where people recognize that everyone is equally deserving of some modicum of care, right? That it's not up to us to decide who gets care based on the color of their skin or how popular they are on Twitter. And so I wanted to kind of push us a bit to recognize how this thing that had become so popular and sort of mindless for us in terms of crowdfunding was actually further normalizing for us the very things that were undermining our impetus for more just healthcare systems.
Can you talk a little bit more about you in the book you talk about, and I hadn't read this before until obviously reading your book, just because you're so brilliant and you made it up. But it's called we've moved in some ways from the deserving poor to the deserving popular.
Yeah. And
you talk about doing a anonymized study where you had on, one hand, I want to say this is a white person from a fairly well-to-do family who had a wonderful photo, and this, nice heartbreaking story, but honestly didn't really need the money all that much, versus somebody who was literally in their deathbed, nearly, near death. And because they couldn't, give some eloquent, soliloquy about, why they needed the money, they weren't able to, meet their funds and, to meet their goals. And it reminded me of that old Chris Rock joke that, like, when I'm poor and hungry, I don't have time to be clever, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things that I did in this research was actually pull together focus groups to look at anonymized campaigns. So we basically would take a real campaign and then kind of strip the identifiers and show people these different campaigns and ask them, can you talk us through how you're thinking about this, how you're reading it? One of the primary comparisons that I asked people to do was between this fairly well-off white woman who was a nurse who had health insurance, who had cancer, and this disabled single dad whose son was also disabled, who was in hospital and was saying that if he didn't get rent money by Friday, they were going to be homeless. And he was worried about how his son was going to survive living in his car because his son relied on some complex medical equipment. And when I set this up, I was like, this is obvious, right? We're going to pick B, right? Like, we get that we're supposed to pick B, and people didn't pick B. And even though a lot of people in these focus groups were very well-meaning people who gave a lot to their communities, they were very able to construct stories for why they were not picking the more needy case. And that included spelling errors. It included blaming this father for not having thought ahead about needing rent money. It included critiquing the quality of the photo on the campaign page. And so I'm interested in what this normalizes for us of how we read each other's need, right? And one of the other stories that I tell in the book is of a very, very popular campaign for some media personalities. It obviously went very well. People did great. But after it was done, I talked to the organizers and they said, well, the reason this campaign did so well is because, so-and-so, that's this person that the campaign was for, well, he's just a really good person. And I tried to kind of push. I was like, yeah, but you're like media producers and you have like tens of thousands of followers on Twitter and like, no, he's just a really good person. And when you're a good person like that, that becomes your form of insurance. And so I began to observe the way that very popular campaigns were equating success with goodness, right? This like moral goodness. And I think that's really even kind of further pushing this very problematic relationship that we already have in America between like deservingness and wealth and privilege and all the other privileges.
How much of that, to your point, how much of that is just, a reflection of what our society is right now, right? I was on King 5 the other day talking about the 4th anniversary of George Floyd's murder, and one of the points of data that was brought up was that only I want to say that 70% of white people have exclusively white social circles, right? And so it's not necessarily. Oh, well, nobody here. I know you're in the 30% who have black friends. So anyway, but I mean the point was, right, that it's very harder to like have a level of empathy for folks that, matches every single person, that you meet. And so, when it comes to things like crowdfunding, knowing that, society is what it is in terms of socioeconomically, that on average, right, black people, specifically black women, are going to have, less affluence, less wealth, than their white counterparts. And yet I want to say that, I believe the data that you pointed to in the book, like 5%, less than 5% of black women are actually successful in terms of getting funding on these crowdfunding sources.
Yeah, so I think it's two intertwined phenomenon that are happening. So the first thing to know is that the vast majority of crowdfunding campaigns do not go viral, and they mostly travel through networks of known family and friends, and are like plenty of social research has shown how our networks are people like us, right? So birds of a feather, the whole thing. And so when a fairly wealthy, well-educated white person sets up a crowdfunding campaign, that campaign is going to go to a lot of people in their network, and it's probably going to do quite a bit better than a campaign that's moving through a much more impoverished network. And given the enormous racial wealth gaps that we have in the U.S., it's pretty easy to tie those racial wealth gaps to outcomes in crowdfunding campaigns. So even though a campaign can be shared more in, for example, a low-income black social network, it's going to earn less a lot of the time. The second thing, though, is outright bias and discrimination. And that happens especially as campaigns become more public and more viral. So we also did a study of looking at the most viral medical campaign. So every medical campaign that had raised over $100,000, and we found about 850 of them. 5 of them were for Black women, and 2 of those were created by white people. And what we saw, even with that tiny, tiny proportion, was a lot of rampant sort of racialized judgment from donors and in the comments. And so we really did see a lot of evidence of those more overt forms of racial bias also playing out as campaigns pick up traction, and also as they move across all these other social media spaces that we know can be really oftentimes racially hostile, right? As well as biased.
Yeah, I guess sticking on that point, you bring this up in the book, and then, obviously we just had, as I mentioned, the anniversary of George Floyd's murder. You talked about how, after his murder in 2020, there was this like barrage of crowdfunding and donations that were going to Black folks from, their white friends, or from, people who, I guess, wanted to, in some ways, assuage their guilt. It almost felt like, I was talking to my girlfriend Danielle about this, it almost felt like the alms or indulgences, right? That, clergy would be paid for, allowing, people's sins to be washed away, so to speak. And so I'm just curious, like, why did it seem that, folks were willing to do that and sort of have their hands washed, and not sort of want to sustain that energy around things that could actually sort of transform our sort of, our social hierarchy?
That's the key question, right? So I sort of retell the story told by Emmanuel Dezotzi about this bizarre phenomenon of people like PayPaling their friends money in the immediate aftermath of the George Floyd murder and everything else. And
I'm Image Green 3000 if y'all want to give anything tonight.
We got a QR code for and I thought he had a great line for it. He called it like, here's $5, sorry for racism. And I think there's a way in which our social media enabled economy has really trained people into doing 2 things. The first is, and this is an idea that comes from Lana Schwartz, is the idea that increasingly our membership and our participation in online communities is facilitated by the transfer of cash and the transfer of small amounts of money through those communities. And that used to not be the case, right? But now a lot of how we participate in those communities happens through transfers of money, small transfers of money. And then the second thing is that we've become very accustomed to doing these small gestures online in order to like solve the problem, right? And I think it gives us a sense of false agency. So I talked to a lot of people in the wake of the Uvalde school shooting who had been giving to crowdfunding campaigns. And we talked about the like deep and profound hurt that they felt about this school shooting and how tragic they thought it was, and just how like connected they felt to these families. And then they talked about donating to crowdfunding campaigns as like the only thing that they could do. It was the only thing that they could think to do to assuage that deep hurt. And I think it, as GoFundMe's own CEO has said, this has become the internet's take action button. And I think that has trained us against a lot of other kinds of taking action. I mean, I can't think of a better example than a crowdfunding campaign for a school shooting victim of something that like is not going to fix the problem at its source, right? You are very much solving the downstream problem, and nothing that you're doing there is necessarily going to stop the next school shooting.
Well, speaking of the CEO of GoFundMe, he said that he doesn't actually want the platform to be used for things like this, right? And like for, medical expenses, he wants it to be used for, honeymoons. You're trying to raise money for that, or like, taking the soccer team to wherever. And yet the reality is, right, I mean, he is profiting off of people's pain, right? I think you're right. That, like, they're in a growth industry, people's pain, right? So how in the world are they able to square, his sort of ideals with the reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think GoFundMe and also other platforms are in a tough position. They claim, at least, and I've talked to founders of some of these platforms, they claim that they didn't develop platforms for this purpose. They really thought, like, we're going to raise money for my kid's soccer team. And then they kind of turned the lights on, and the next thing they knew, it was just houses that burned down and people with cancer, and they just kind of were like, whoa. And as one founder told me, he was like, all this was out there in the market latent, and we didn't know until we turned it on what was out there and how it was going to be used. But I think there's a PR problem for GoFundMe that they're constantly running up against, which is like, be depressing enough to like get people to donate to you, but don't be so depressing that you ruin our brand, right? And I think that's kind of part of what they're trying to get at here. And so they'll say things like, Congress, we can't do your job for you. We need you to pass pandemic assistance bills. But at the same time, they are constantly profiting from those circumstances. So regardless of how well a campaign does or what circumstances are causing it to happen in the first place, GoFundMe is poised to make money.
Wow. Well, where do I go from here?
A ray of sunshine. Just keep going.
Well, on that note, you do talk about, though, ultimately that this is all just a function of neoliberalism, which, to be reductionary, right, is just that everything, nothing is a public good. Like everything needs to filter through a market mechanism. And so, can you just talk a little bit more about why that strand of thought that is, from Ronald Reagan to Margaret Thatcher, who you say they used to call Tina, meaning there is no alternative to the neoliberal system, how that has unfortunately, ended us to where we are, or gotten us to where we are today.
Yeah, I think it's gotten us to where we are today, and it's also impeded our ability to imagine and create other ways of coming into community together and building the kinds of worlds that we want to see and the kinds of health systems that we want to see. So if it's okay if I just actually read that section really quickly.
Please.
I promise it's not long, but I think I wrote it better than I'm going to say it. So in the book, I talk about how we live in what I call the meanwhile. So what do we do as we're waiting for these better systems to be made, and we're left with tools like GoFundMe to try and paddle ourselves upstream. And so I write, a consequence of the late neoliberal project is that our economic, social, and technological realities have become so entrenched that imagining change feels impossible. As Angela Davis observed, dangerous limits have been placed on the very possibility of imagining alternatives. These ideological limits have to be contested. We have to begin to think in different ways. Our future is at stake. So one of the architects of neoliberalism, Margaret Thatcher, so frequently used the phrase, there is no alternative, to describe her economic and social policies that she was named Tina. As Paul Farmer describes, the mental hegemony of neoliberalism limits our ability to recognize the value of more collective and just health systems. The commonweal, Farmer writes, the sense of shared opportunities and misfortunes that bind us together. After all, what is pooled risk, if not sharing, is often one of the first casualties of hardcore neoliberalism. So what is the alternative becomes a question that invites hopelessness rather than imagination. Dreaming up alternatives can be an act of resistance and a pragmatic strategy for beginning to remake and reimagine our current systems. At first glance, we might think of crowdfunding as a convenient time-saving alternative to dealing with the complexities and costs of the U.S. healthcare system. It fills a gap conveniently. But this book tries to show that rather than being an alternative to the moral and financial toxicities of our current health system, crowdfunding reinforces both its functions and its values. Rather than being an alternative, it distracts us from alternatives, diverts our attention and energy away from fighting for them. So in this final section of the book, I offer some thoughts on meaningful alternatives and adaptations of crowdfunding that might otherwise be hard to imagine. This is by no means a comprehensive account of alternatives, but rather an invitation to engage in a more collective project of imagining and creating other ways to connect, to care for each other, to cultivate repair in a time of crisis. I offer these alternatives with the recognition that we must all figure out, as Lauren Berlant puts it, how best to live on, considering. We are all living, as it were, in the meanwhile, in the aftermath and rubble of accumulated and persistent crisis, and before the kinds of change we would hope to see have come to pass. But living in the meanwhile is not about surrender or accommodation, but engaging in the smaller acts of repair, change, care, and community building that can add up to something bigger. As Ruha Benjamin explains in her amazing book, Viral Justice, all the great transformations that societies undergo rely on the low-key scheming of everyday people. So let's get scheming.
Yeah, I wanted to steal that whole entire phrase for myself, but I do. Before we open it up to audience questions, I did want to ask you. So much of this book is you talking to various people, writing down their stories, trying to tell them ethically. Not all of these stories are tragedies. Some are, end in success. Some end in ambiguity. But is there any particular story or person you talk to that it still sticks to your mind's ribcage?
Yeah, I think the story that probably weighs most heavily on me that I carry is the story of Trevor, who was a single dad in Arkansas, who was really struggling. He had type 1 diabetes. He was recovering from a terrible accident. He talked about struggling to figure out if he could pay for insulin or keep his house from foreclosure. And in a series of text messages that he sent me late night one night, he talked to me about how he knew how to create a campaign that would tell this story and that would make him seem deserving. But when he went on GoFundMe and he started looking around, he saw all of these campaigns for people that were just even more tragic than him. And he kind of said to me, like, who the fuck am I to put my shit up there? And so he wrote the campaign, he built it because he really needed help, and then he never told anyone about it. And so he just put it up there and he said, it's like I'm dropping a line into the water. I'm hoping someone will come along and find it. And that to me really captures some of the shame and the complexity of what people are going through when they're trying to figure out whether to do this. And I think it humanizes for a lot of us what that struggle is like and what is not visible to us when we're just kind of trolling through these sites or getting sent them on Facebook from time to time.
Yeah, I believe it was his story where you kind of coined the term crisis ordinariness,
Yeah.
I want to say. And while you were obviously talking about medical expenses and healthcare, I couldn't help but think, as somebody who does a lot of reporting on working class people, how that is everything from childcare to rent to food, insecurity. Mm-hmm. And so you bring up in the book, when in the chapter on solutions, you bring up and highlight mutual aid in the city of Seattle specifically, and how some of those things are still in operation. And so I want to ask you, how do the successes and the continuation of some of those mutual aid initiatives continue to, and how should it inform how we live in the meanwhile and how we build the world that we want to actually live in?
Yeah, I mean, I think mutual aid has this really beautiful, long-standing history in communities of activism and marginalized communities of figuring out a way to meet people where they're at and how to meet their immediate needs, and also how to plot for this larger change towards the future, right? How to do the community organizing and the education and the solidarity building that gets us slowly, so slowly towards these better steps in the future. And Amy Hagopian and I and grad student Emily Hops got to spend some time with mutual aid organizers during the pandemic. And, a lot of these organizers went into it feeling like, okay, we're doing this for a couple months. We're going to figure out how to get some masks and some tests to people and, and they're still doing it. And there's a stickiness to those, to that work. And that work is incredibly difficult and messy. It's so messy and it's so hard. But I think we can draw some inspiration from those types of doing that work that is long-term, and it's engaged, and it's thinking about the hard ethical questions, and it's building community, and it's not just like donating $5 and sorry for racism. And it's, really thinking about like, how do we build, the critical consciousness that we need, as well as recognize that you have needs and I have needs right now. And those also need to be addressed.
Well, the book is crowded out. Nora Kenworthy, thank you so very much.
You're the best. Thank you. Well, Marcus, it really does remind me that Trump's big, beautiful bill is just a really elaborate way of saying, go fund yourself to every American without a trust fund or a billionaire sugar daddy.
Yes, I gotta say crowdfunding is perfect for America because it combines our love of charity with our hatred of actually solving problems. It's like, why fix healthcare when you can just make sick people compete for donations? It is really like, God, I mean, there are times where I'm like, we really do like live in dystopia, masquerading as like just, our normal life day to day.
Yeah. And like, what do we do with the like mental gymnastics of donating to people's crowdfunding campaigns? Because we've like, what else are we going to do?
Right.
And also feeling so helpless. Right. And I think one of the things that has been really lovely and refreshing to me about this podcast is that we've gotten to talk to people who are actually making a difference in their communities in ways that aren't just like crowdfunding or like thoughts and prayers on the internet.
Right. Jeez, I don't know which one is worse, actually. But yeah, I mean, I think, that's ultimately the thing. Like, and like, I to your point, as you said, in even back then in your town hall talk, right? I mean, there are some people who have been helped for crowdfunding. We're not trying to like denigrate it as a in its entirety, but we are saying, right, that I mean, these are structural issues that we need to focus on, right? And these are structural issues that aren't going to be fixed by giving $10 or $20 or $15 to somebody who has been able to persuade you that they're more deserving than somebody else. This is about fixing a system that type of thing is even necessary.
Yes. Yeah. And building systems that lift everyone up, right? I mean, we talk on this podcast every week about our 8 ounces of joy, but if you want 8 ounces of depression right now, just like go to GoFundMe and Google ICE deportation GoFundMes. There's thousands of them.
Yeah.
For people whose family members have been deported, or like look at the thousands and thousands of campaigns that have been set up for Palestinians trying to flee Gaza, and how little this strategy has worked for them, and also how difficult it is to otherwise get financial aid to people in Gaza. It's not working. we need better systems. We got to build them ourselves.
Yes, we do. And I will say thank you again for your book, Nora, that everybody should read. It is in the show notes. It's easy to get, and it's definitely, if nothing else, it is certainly provides grist for a conversation that repeatedly needs to be had in this country.
Well, thanks for chatting with me about it, both now and then. I appreciate it.
It's very meta. It's like I'm talking to our past selves in the future. This is great. Yeah. That being said, Nora, like now that we've thoroughly depressed people, how would you like to share your 8 ounces of joy today?
Not 8 ounces of depression, 8 ounces of joy. Well, mine is actually, I don't know, I feel like mine is really basic, but this weekend I sort of freaked out about it being the end of summer and got a last minute backpacking permit to take my daughter backpacking on the Olympic Peninsula, which is just so beautiful. It's like such a magical place. And, we were out there, we were camping on a beach, and I was thinking about something that actually Dean Spade said in his interview with us, which was he was sort of saying like, why is anyone trying to go to Mars? Like, Earth is magic.
Yes.
It's
yes, it
like
is.
actual magic. And I was sitting on this beach and just thinking to myself, it's so magical. And I like, that seems really simplistic to say, but when things get hard for me in my life, one of the places I turn to is the outdoors. And I was really grateful for it this weekend, and also grateful for all the like somehow still cheery national park employees who were like still out there doing jobs.
It's called denial, Nora. It's called denial.
Oh my God, no, they're so
No,
nice.
just joking.
Still out there like cleaning bathrooms while like the Trump administration like eviscerates their funding. So shout out to national park employees.
No, absolutely. I do love what you said about it being simple, right? It's the right kind of simple, right? Where it's just getting out in nature and just fully being, and what do they say? Touching grass for a little while.
Touching grass.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, my 8 ounces of joy is, I know we talked about this offline for a bit, but there have been a slew of white women who have been putting Mexican flags on their vehicles just to waste ICE's time, right? I mean, I guess that's the marker for ICE, right? Where it's like, oh, Mexican flag, they must be an illegal immigrant. And so I just want to really quickly recite this post on Threads from a woman who did this. And she said, "I am as white as a hotel towel." And she obviously doesn't stay at the Motel 6. Anyway, "I am as white as a hotel towel. And the closest thing to Mexican I am was a single all-inclusive resort stay in Cancun. I put a Mexican flag sticker on my old Tacoma and was promptly pulled over by ICE in San Antonio. I'm happy to waste their time. Their big question was like, why the sticker? I told them it was on the truck when I bought it, and they suggested I remove it. Such obnoxious creatures." And I will tell you, it's not marching in the street. Obviously, it's not, anything that is, systemic in terms of the change that's going to happen. But it is kind of petty. But it's also a very good petty to me in terms of
It totally is.
in terms of the opportunity cost, right? Where they're there, ICE agents are there for an hour. That's talking to her. They're not there. They're not somewhere else in terms of like at a Lowe's or raiding a church or raiding a school or otherwise just terrorizing our immigrant community. So shout out to those white ladies. I mean, it's in some ways it's the least they can do. They did benefit most from affirmative action and DEI. So hey, I mean, here you go. This is the get back. So
Yes.
shout out to them. That's my 8 ounces of joy.
I love it.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that old FBI field manual on like how to destroy systems from within. And it's like,
yeah.
waste their time.
Yes.
Frustrate them.
Gum up the works if you can. Yes.
And like, if anyone is good at doing that, I feel like it's white ladies. And I say that as a white lady myself. So here's to using our powers for good.
Yes. And actual allyship. Thank you. Thank you. My God. All right. Well, shall we go ahead and read ourselves out for today?
It's as good a time as any.
Awesome.
Well, congratulations to all of us on surviving another week of crowdfunding civilizational collapse while politicians double down on thoughts and prayers policymaking. We're grateful that you spent part of it listening to us and our terrible jokes.
Indeed. If you like what you hear, or if you just want to prevent us from having to start a GoFundMe campaign called Save 2 chronically overcaffeinated and barely functioning millennials from eternal basement podcasting, you can support our work at inthemeanwhilepodcast.com. As always, a huge thank you to our producer, Jessica Partnow, and to Aham Aluo for our music. A special thank you this week to Town Hall Seattle for sharing audio of our live event there. You can find In the Meanwhile wherever you get your podcasts, or follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and Blue Sky. And now Threads, actually. Yeah. New episodes drop every Friday. Until then, we'll see you in the meanwhile.